So thank you, guys. I'm the person who was over there a moment ago. I'll be moderating this. Unfortunately or fortunately, you'll be seeing a lot of me because I'm moderating the first and third panels. But we are absolutely delighted to have a terrific expert panel here talking about the use of large language models in law. Our panelists are extremely accomplished. In the interest of time, I will only give a very short biography of our panelists, but I encourage you to look up their very extensive accomplishments online. Let me start with Pablo Arrendado. He's co-founder and chief innovation officer at Casetext, which is one of the first companies using a product called Co-Counsel, which actually is a version of what I was suggesting is a good idea in terms of putting a layer between the user and the direct GPT model. So Pablo can talk about it. His model is for lawyers, and on the back end, it works with GPT-4, but make sure that the lawyers have their data safe and secure, so they're not just uploading private information to OpenAI. Next, we have Megan Ma, who works with me as assistant director of the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics, or the Codex Center at Stanford University. Megan has a PhD in law and linguistics and is one of the leading experts in AI and law. Next to Megan is Daniel Schwartz, who is a law professor at the University of Minnesota and has done really interesting work on GPT and its use in law. And also, he wrote a really interesting paper with several co-authors where they tried to trick law professors into seeing if they could determine whether a exam answer written by GPT was as good as a student, and he could tell you, not really trick, but see if they could figure out and if it could perform at the same level. I won't give the spoiler on that. And last but not least is Jason Adaska, who has been working for years in AI and law and is the director of innovation at Holland and Hart LLP. So thank you to this amazing panel for joining us. I'm going to start out with the first question to Pablo. So Pablo, what are some of the abilities that this technology, and we're talking about particular GPT-4 and large language technologies, can do compared to just early last year and before?
All right. Yeah. First of all, thank you guys so much for having us. This is a real privilege to get to talk to you about this stuff. Right. So we were shown GPT-4 very early in September of last year. And my co-founder, Jake, and I basically within 48 hours had pivoted the entire company to do nothing but focus on it. We had been working with large language models since their inception, 5 years earlier. And we had been shown GPT-3, which we thought was neat and kind of had some cool tricks, but wasn't ready for prime time. What we saw in GPT-4 was basically a literacy that was of a qualitatively different nature than anything we had seen. And while you're going to hear this called the generative AI revolution, I submit to you that for the legal profession, it's really not that they can generate text that matters. It's that it can read it and interpret it and annotate it and structure it and restructure it. So for example, we have a Fortune 50 client that was a beta client and said, we have these little nemesis, these little expert witnesses that just wake up every day and testify about how our products aren't safe. That's kind of how they make their living. Could I take every expert report that this guy's ever done and every deposition transcript they've ever done and give me questions for cross-examination, find inconsistencies between what they said? And I said, look, we'll try this, but I just don't think that's a bit much, right? It's not going to work. Well, I was wrong. I said it was not going to work twice. It worked again for somebody else, right? So that ability to go through and substantively identify inconsistencies in a way that an attorney would find those useful things, right? That is not sort of grunge work, right? That is not, just putting on certain filling out forms in a certain way. To my mind, that's the sort of thing that we see GPT-4 doing, whereas even, GPT 3.5, really just wasn't up for it at the same level. And did you mention the bar exam? Have we done that?
Oh, no, go right ahead.
Right. So we were working with OpenAI, and I was like, our colleagues Dan Katz and Michael Bomarito had used the earlier model and put out a paper called GPT Takes the Bar. They should have called it GPT fails the bar because there, a lot of confusion happened from that. But the earlier model failed miserably. It got in like the 10th percentile. Well, with GPT-4, we got in the 90th percentile. We redid the study. And then for good measure, we actually included essays and the multi-state performance test, right? The full bar exam. So I think I'll end with this. ChatGPT is great for raising awareness, but to my mind, it's a little bit like, imagine a society that had never seen cars, and then here comes the first car, but everyone's just doing donuts on the lawn and then doing 90 in reverse on the freeway. Like, I'm glad you know about cars, but using them well and responsibly is a very different experience than using them incorrectly, where you're typing in things and getting hallucinated at and all these things. So,
well, that's a really good point. One point I really liked about what you mentioned was its ability to read and synthesize as something I didn't emphasize, which is just generating documents. And I really agree with you. That is a huge game changer in law. Let me throw out the same question to the other panelists. What do you see are some of the new abilities of this technology? And just put up a finger if you're interested in replying. Yes, Jason.
Yeah, so continuing along the same theme, we've seen older models be very good at summarization, those sorts of texts where you take some input, a lot of different kind of text, and needed to provide the kind of highlights associated with it. But the inference, the reasoning capabilities, I think is unexpected, not only to users, but to my understanding, to a lot of the researchers for this as well, right? That's the kind of delta where it's not just, rote tasks or not just sort of document generation, but actually doing more complicated inference and legal reasoning. It's surprising because it is not the kind of thing that you would expect a language model, right? Something that just has patterns in language to be able to do. It's emergent just from seeing lots of examples. So I think there's questions that we have, which are essentially, what are the boundaries, right? How complicated of a scenario can it get? And I think people who are doing experiments right now are trying to understand where that frontier is and how much it'll change in the future.
So the other thing I think is pretty important to understand is, so far we've been talking in a sense about, you answer the question, you get the answer, and then that's sort of the answer, and some of them are good, some of them not. What's really pretty amazing about it, in my mind, is that you can have this dialogue with it where you get it to further refine its answers to match what you want, okay? So a lot of times its first answer may not focus on what you want, or may answer a different question, or you may actually realize your own question was not great. And this happens a lot in law practice, right? For folks who aren't experienced managers, you'll tell an associate, hey, go write a memo about this issue or this, and they'll write it, and you'll realize either they didn't quite understand what you wanted, or maybe you weren't as clear as you probably should have been about exactly the scope of what you wanted. But because of how quickly it works, and because it retains a memory effectively about that dialogue, you can sort of in real time get it to adjust to the point where you want it. And I think that's something that folks who have not actually really tried in a sustained way to use this have realized, right? A lot of times you'll see, oh, it produced the first version of this and it's not exactly what I wanted. This is not good, or it hallucinated it. But if you sort of stick with it and use it in a sustained way, you can get much, much better very quickly at, say, having a draft a contract, right? You can say, okay, we'll draft that first version of a contract. Gee, now find ambiguities in what you wrote. Great. Now, please expand on that one provision and have it create some incentive structure. So it really actually can essentially replicate what can sometimes be, my experience, a months-long process where you get a work product back, you say, go back and fix it, go back and figure out this answer, and you can't anticipate always where the issues are going to be. You can do that in real time in a matter of minutes. And so I think that's a really important element of the technology that that folks need to work on, because it is also part of it uses legal skills to be able to realize, where are the deficiencies, where do I want you to expand, where did you not take this in quite the right direction I had hoped.
That is a really good point. I think, at least right now, the technology, it takes some getting used to to figure out how to best use it. So at the beginning, I was not very good at it, and then you learn, the things that it can do and what it can't do and how to work with it. And I think you're absolutely right to encourage people to not just look at the first output, but to experiment with nudging it down the line, which is also one of the huge advances. As I said earlier, that we talk about natural language, quote, understanding, because again, it's not a little human in there. But previous technology could not reliably understand what you were asking or correcting it. We've all used these chatbots online, and you ask it, get me a customer service representative, and it says, do you want to order a pizza, right? So now GPT-4 very reliably understands exactly what you want it to. Megan?
I also want to kind of maybe put out an alternative perspective that these advances don't also come from nowhere, as you sort of pointed out. I think if you look into areas of cognitive science and linguistics, there are kind of these traces of an ancestry where this isn't kind of unforeseen entirely. There's an area called cognitive pragmatics, and within a sort of subfield of linguistics, you see kind of pragmatics as almost these contextual understanding, and you see kind of this area that emerged about what you perceive as a conversation game between two humans. And part of this kind of nudging or being able to tease out information, there are existing sort of techniques that are done in linguistics to better understand and interpret one another. And we see that actually with training on human feedback, that might have been one of the accelerators that, as you rightfully pointed out. So while these are kind of exciting advances, I think what's also exciting about ChatGPT and generative AI and large language models broadly is that a lot of these fields that were in disparate sort of silos are now coming into a deep intersection. And I think that's particularly what's making this especially interesting.
Could you say a little bit more about the connection between instruction fine-tuning and other disciplines? Because I didn't know that. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, so this is a paper that predated just slightly the emergence of ChatGPT, and there was a cognitive science and a programmer, his name is Evan Pugh, who looked into kind of the way in which human and machines communicate. And he basically asked a general question, why is it so unintuitive for us to speak to machines? And over time, they kind of discovered that it is because in the way that we communicate and task things between humans, we actually set out goals, and then it's a search strategy to identify the solution to that goal. And so they started to mirror or find ways in which they called natural programs. And I think that these techniques actually had helped, and it came in the form of, say, instruction fine-tuning. But essentially what he did, and his team did, was they kind of tried to train a data set and build a data set that is entirely built on natural language instruction between one another on abstract and reasoning tasks. And I feel like that really kind of played a role in the way that ChatGPT and other large language models are now coming to be.
Oh, that's fascinating. And it's also a plug for interdisciplinarity and working together with, outside of academic silos. Any other comments on the first question? All right, the next question is for Jason. So as we said, this technology is good, but it's not perfect, and we want to make sure we are very clear about the limitations. And so I'll ask Jason, what do you see as some of the limits, and do you see as sort of short-term limits that will go away in the coming years, and longer-term limits for which we don't really know what to do?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I think there's several limitations that people are thinking about, some which I think are short term and some which are going to be longer term. The one that I think is on the top of everybody's mind, and it's one, Harry, that you had mentioned at the beginning, was sort of inaccurate or outdated information. The way most people are interacting with these tools now is essentially just asking it a question out of the blue, right? Not providing any context. And it, with the newer models, is a lot better at being able to, not hallucinate, but it still can happen, and that's fundamental to how these models work, right? They're probabilistic pattern matching. There are a number of techniques that can be used right now to reduce that. One of those, Harry, you had mentioned, which is, not ask the system just to draw from its general knowledge all of those 175 billion weights. What is the right case law, but actually provide some context, some sets of documents for it to reason about as part of the prompt. That's one technique right now that's extremely effective for being able to kind of reduce hallucinations. There's also things that are happening in the ecosystem that are extending what these tools do natively by being able to pull in external sources of information. So, OpenAI has sort of released a beta version of what they call plugins. So you can ask it a question and have it not just use what you asked, what was on trained weights, but actually provide connections to real-time data streams. It'll go out and it'll query and add to the prompt to get a lot better answers. So I think the sort of verification, the up-to-date information, that's a problem right now, but I think just really in the next few months is probably going to be less of a concern that people have. The other limitation, and this one's a little bit amusing to me as somebody who's been kind of working in technology and AI for a while, is these large language models are in a lot of ways kind of the dual of what computers traditionally have been very good at, right? We think about, calculators and computers as being things that crunch numbers, right? Can do, complicated decision tree logic, if-thens. And, large language models are based on these kind of probabilistic reasoning. So, for instance, you may ask it to do some reasoning about tax law, but you probably want to double check the arithmetic, right, that it's actually using to do calculations. Again, those are the sorts of things that I think in maybe the next year or so are going to be resolved, not by any fundamental change to how large language models work, but by incorporating sort of other modules and plugins, right? So instead of just having the large language model having to answer arithmetic questions itself, being able to kind of use other pieces, right, to be able to solve those, right? Folks have probably seen it play chess. It does chess relatively well, but it's not going to play chess as well as Stockfish or some of the other kind of custom systems that are out there. The third thing, and this is actually, at first blush, I think it may seem a bit pedestrian, but I think is actually a relatively important limit for a lot of legal applications. And that's something that's going to sound silly, which is the buffer size associated with these. So GPT-4 can have as input and output something like 100 pages worth of documents, 100 pages worth of words. There are a number of use cases that are specifically relevant for legal, where having the system be able to kind of reason about a large swath of input and be able to make connections between some of those are going to be important, and at least right now is somewhat limiting. There's engineering workarounds, but in general, it's going to be limited. I'll give you an example that our group has worked with. So if you are doing, responding to something like an obviousness rejection for a patent application, the examiner responds back to you and says, I'm not going to give you sort of a patent. I'm going to reject some certain claims because I've seen that there's a patent A and a patent B that's out there, and a clever person could combine patent A and patent B, sort of describe what you're claiming is a new invention. An attorney who is responding to that now has to do reasoning where you're looking across so triangulated information about a whole patent, one patent, another patent, your own application, and sort of drawing inferences across those. That's the kind of legal reasoning that sort of requires a big working buffer, right, of space. And right now, there are some limitations. There's some hard limitations for how many tokens or words you can put into this. And there's also some question of how well it's going to work to scale. I think the way we're used to thinking about computers and technology as having hard limits measured in things like how fast does the CPU go, how much working memory do you have. I think this kind of buffer size is something that's going to be the next sort of scaling parameter that the engineers who are working on this are going to have to actually work hard to be able to expand. The fourth thing, and this is not so much of a technical item, but I'll mention it because it's, I think, relevant for a lot of people who are putting the technology to use. As Harry pointed out, law is one of those things where invention of facts is frowned upon. So I think that there has been two threads of kind of conversation about using this technology in law. One, which is, oh my gosh, this is amazing. It can do legal reasoning. It can actually do substantive work. What is this going to do in terms of kind of supercharging the practice of law? And the other thread, which is, oh my gosh, it might make stuff up. And we need to stay away from this. This is radioactive. I think the conversation about how to use the technology in a trustful way is right now, it's not a technology problem as much as just a cultural problem for people understanding how to use it, what are the right safeguards. I actually think that is going to take probably a couple of years for people to kind of get used to, for clients to kind of become comfortable with, for attorneys to become comfortable with.
Those are really great observations, so thank you. Let me turn this out to the rest of the panel. Anyone want to talk about limits? Megan.
Yeah, so I think one point that you made, Jason, that I thought was really interesting is the idea of plugins and kind of different ways that folks out there in this field are trying to almost mediate for some of these limitations. And one paper that came out recently that I thought was really interesting was actually Hugging GPT, where essentially they were trying to leverage the strengths of ChatGPT, it being so great at communicating with humans, and then using it almost to triage to models that are built for specific tasks. And I think that we see a future where we don't necessarily have to have one model do everything. Yes, we see, Midjourney, for example, is a particularly great example at text to image generation. We're gonna see, I think, more and more of almost models becoming like tour guides and kind of directing you to what you want to.
Could you just say a little bit more about what does it mean for GPT-4 as a model to talk to other models, like for those who might not understand that terminology or those ideas?
Yeah, so we're starting to kind of see almost part of the emergent behaviors between models is their ability to signal in a way various, I guess, tasks and to kind of direct and say like, hey, we think that this is a particular task, and they kind of parcel it out and allow models that are, so for example, Hugging GPT, basically they had leveraged the fact that Hugging Face, which is kind of this big repository of machine learning models, they know that some models are better than others, and they kind of use it as a kind of segue into others. And to be honest, I'm not 100% sure of the technical elements behind that, but what I do see is, this ability to almost build layers on top of models that are able to kind of better refine what are the tasks and what are the, work that is specialized, for a particular field.
Yeah, that's great. And then maybe a way to think about it is something Jason was saying, where the GPT is sort of the middle person who listens to what's coming in and then decides, oh, this is a math problem, I'm going to send it out to a calculator. This is an image generation problem, I'm going to send it out to an image generation. So it's kind of the middle.
I just elaborate on one that may have come up earlier, but also the scarcity of the chips to run this stuff. So Paul Lomeo, who was the director of Stanford Law Library when I was at law school, told me that in the early days of online research, they would tell the Stanford kids you're not allowed to use it between like 11 and 2 because that's peak New York time. So basically, you guys can't do online research, New York's turn to do it. And what I've found is that we find ourselves in something similar. Right now, we are literally burning through these servers that we have. There's more people wanting to use it than we can, and it's slowing things down. We're getting more servers. They're not only extremely expensive, but they're also just like, you can't just order as many as you want. They're like partitioning them out. And so, case text, we've always been, for instance, all students could sign up for free, all judges, et cetera. We've had to change that right now. We've had to be much more judicious on who we can get it out. And so I think there's going to be some distributive justice issues with this. Not that, Westlaw brings its own distributive justice issues just fine without AI. But I think we're going to see this as something that's it's sort of pronounced, that getting access to the actual chips to run, especially, I mean, the really good, like latest models. I think the earlier models are getting better and faster and cheaper.
Let me just follow up on that, because that's a great point. Do you see that as a problem of the moment? So right now you can run models like Llama that aren't nearly as good as GPT-4, but 2 years ago would have required a data center to run, and now you can run it on your laptop. 2 years from now, do you see running something like
Yeah,
GPT?
I mean, there's so much sort of capitalist pressure and evolutionary pressure, and you know, boy, that capitalistic pressure could do a lot. So I think there's a lot of incentives, but you know, creating new plants to create these chips is not an overnight thing, right? I mean, this is something where it's just, there's a lag time even when you decide to do it. And you know, Microsoft's trying to corner the market on some, and then it's just a complete geopolitical thing. So, but in the meantime, literally, and like right now we're kind of like, oh, on a demo, like, look how cool we are. Like, it's not even working, it's so slow because everyone wants it. And it's working for right now, but I think that's going to get old pretty quickly when they start to.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Dan, did you have a comment?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to follow up on another element of because I think hallucinations and sort of the question of is the AI making up facts? That's one of the biggest questions that are out there and biggest concerns. And one of the things, and we've talked, and Harry talked about a number of techniques that can be used to mitigate that and how the AIs are getting better. But I think one of the real possibilities here is using the AIs to help you fact check, right? So at the end of the day, these AIs are good enough that you can ask them, look, substantiate your claim, show me the underlying text. Okay, give me the information. And so, you know, actually, I'm one of the privileged few who has been able to use case text, and it has these amazing technologies where it doesn't just give you an answer. It will then give you the quotations from the underlying documents, so that it makes actually site checking, the type of site checking you might do as a young associate or as a law review editor, you know, relatively easy, and you can go back and verify it. You can even do this within GPT-4 now. It takes a little bit more engineering, but you can say, look, please give me an answer. And then the next question is, okay, provide me with a direct quotation from the underlying source that I can see to substantiate that. And then you can go back and do your, so there are tools in place to facilitate the type of site checking, the type of verification that you need to do that are really, you'd want to do that with any legal document, right? To make sure that the underlying references to the cases are accurate, the underlying references to the, whatever it is, the depositions or the underlying emails are accurate. So I think that it is much less of a hurdle than initially some people may have made it out to be, that these systems hallucinate, because you can also actually use these systems to ensure that what they are saying is represented accurately in the underlying documents that you're providing it.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a terrific point. Let me put the next question to Megan. So many of us here are lawyers, and we're interested in, wow, can this technology be used in law? Should it be used in law? So Megan, where do you see these technologies being usefully deployed within law, and what are some of the benefits and risks?
Yeah, so I think how I see this question, and put differently, is sort of what are the relevant use cases, and more importantly, what do I really have to do in terms of changing my own processes to accommodate for sort of using these tools. And I think just by the examples that you've shown, it's basically showing remarkable performance. But I think the operative word of that question really is usefully. Because a lot of what people think about is, even when there's any technology out, it's like, will I really use it? That's why I defer back to Word, that kind of like mentality. And I think essentially what we want to embrace in the coming future is the possibility of having it leverage this type of technology to do, basic legal work, which will enable sort of better access to legal services, for example, or expansion into pro bono services. We think of it as being able to kind of help with legal aid clinics, for example, accelerate issue and legal diagnoses, and helping to kind of service more clients in need. The other side of it is, because a lot of what we've contextualized right now is experiments, we're doing experiments, we have lots of experiments, we actually haven't really thought about integration into, or practical integration into our processes. And so until we kind of get past experimenting, that's when we really can move into what we think is practical use. And so some of the questions that we might be thinking of asking is, yes, it's capable of drafting contracts, but what then are the edits that our associates or counsel will have to do on top of that? We might see that they're conducting really complex legal analyses, but how should lawyers then react to this type of analysis? What do we do further? What is that next step? And we can reimagine, for example, new methods of it being able to build legal arguments, for example, or maybe, it's creating that first draft, that first template, and it also, offers these very specific, highly specified annotated commentary that, it took maybe a year or two for a first-year associate that's entering your law firm to then be able to kind of pick up what experience means in your law firm. And now you're able to do that kind of through these annotations within your drafts. I think part of our center, one of the ongoing research elements that we work on is trying to uncover how legal expertise actually differs across seniority and specialization. And so we're trying to better represent what actually is that value add that you get from like seniority and partner level expertise. And what we're seeing here is these models being able to maybe capture these differences in legal opinions and use them actually as a strength, right? We're allowing lawyers to be able to gain new insights or sort of expand their critical thinking. And kind of going forward from that, we anticipate more of an embodiment. And what I mean by that is we're getting into a space where we can simulate circumstances of potentially negotiation, litigation, or merger strategy before it happens, and other sort of dynamic interactions that we weren't able to gameplay before. Or, for example, we had a sparring partner within the law firm, but now imagine that kind of as a crowdsourced type thing through these tools. But to the second part of the question, there's no technology or tool that we use without risk. But one of the main issues, at least I see it, is that risk is ill-defined in itself, especially in the field of artificial intelligence and in large language models. So we heard, questions about data privacy. We know that, for example, ChatGPT is being investigated in Spain. It's also being investigated in Canada. In Italy, it's been full out banned. There's also a lack of transparency around the data that it has been trained on. We know that it's been trained on a lot of text, but what text exactly and what are the weights, we don't really know. And there's also this sort of no man's land around the protections of using these models. So I use these models, kind of what do I do from there? This is particularly concerning, of course, when the information is sensitive, of confidential nature. And we've seen, of course, that case text with co-counsel has put in those guardrails. And so these concerns aren't necessarily there maybe for those who are in a corporate, large-scale law firm setting. But what we're seeing is even between ChatGPT, this free version, and GPT-4, there are monumental differences. And so the concerns around data remain at large then for the everyday person. And so the point I made earlier about kind of access to legal services and kind of leveraging these large language models to kind of minimize this gap actually kind of resurface if we have very large gaps between the performance of these models, the free version versus the kind of paid for version. And this is just risk sort of at the foundational technical level. Risks also can be looked at from the lens of use and interactions with these models and the harms that can come out of it. There's actually really well thought out taxonomies of harm and risk that are being put out there actually by DeepMind, Google themselves, and by communities of responsible AI and AI ethics communities. But they kind of remain at a level of generality. They don't translate well into a specific domain, such as law. And the question even about evaluations or auditing, you might hear from Anthropic that they put themselves out there as robust, safe, transparent AI, but what does that really mean? We don't even have a consensus around what are the relevant auditing tools or what evaluations we can benchmark against. And so kind of having these limited understandings, I want to think about kind of the tools that we use that are most pervasive in our everyday work. We think about Google Workspace, we think about Microsoft 365. Actually, these companies are going to be integrating directly large language models. And so already right now in our practices, we have things like autocomplete, grammar spell check. But if you think about it, sort of that added layer on top, we talk about personalities. So Harry pointed out kind of the difference between even Bing and OpenAI, and its kind of aggressive nature. We don't necessarily know what those personalities and how we're able to necessarily negotiate and speak back with those machines. And so that's probably one thing that is a risk that we need to be a little mindful about, because harms don't actually always come in the place of being glaringly obvious. Sometimes they come in very subtle, nuanced, and behavioral nudges, such as those. So if you were not someone who knew actually very clearly that difference in IP questions and had that argument with Bing, would you succumb to what Bing has answered, or would you kind of be able to negotiate back? So I think a lot more of research needs to be done on actually what questions of contextualized harm and risk, and I think that is what we'll have to do in this sort of buffer period as we look more into a large language model.
Wow, thank you for that really comprehensive answer. And to your point, I felt like I had hit a new life low when I got in an extended argument with an AI chatbot. So that was not my proudest moment. Let me toss this out to the panel. What do you guys think in terms of benefits, risks? Jason?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess in terms of incorporating this specifically kind of into legal, one of the things that I think is really interesting about how this technology has caught on, and it's a little bit of maybe differs in some ways from the point that you made earlier in your presentation, Harry, which is in the future, there's probably going to be other technology that sits in front, and it may not be a chat interface. I'd actually push back on that a bit. It's certainly going to be the case this is going to be in a lot of tools. But I think one of the things that has allowed ChatGPT to be so successful is that it's in an interface that people don't have to learn how it works. You're using natural language. I mean, in fact, even the workflow for it, draft something, no, that's not right. Can you please, fix this particular paragraph? That's the way that attorneys work right now. The change is just that you're not working with a person in many cases. Now you're working with sort of a machine that happens to be interacting in that same way. I think that what's exciting is when you have technology that, the people who are using it don't have to change, right, what they're doing. It's kind of the technology has come to them. And I think that's what we're seeing with the chat interface and large language models, is you have this very general purpose, Swiss Army knife interface. You don't have to learn it. You don't have to read a user manual. You don't have to know what button to press. You just chat with it. And there's obviously, as we talked about, ways to do that more or less effectively. But they're really around what you would use to talk to a person more or less effectively. I think there's always going to be that, and I think that's actually one of the things that will allow this technology to be really transformative, specifically in legal, which has a history of being pretty conservative in terms of, hey, let's change how we're working, let's use some other tools. I think people, since the tool allows the kind of interaction that are natural in many ways, I think that's what's going to help it get adoption.
Terrific point, and friendly refinement accepted. Pablo.
So I oscillate between optimism and pessimism with this stuff. As the optimistic side to me, so when the computer first came out, Isaac Asimov wrote an article called "Who's Afraid of the Computer?" And he opens by talking about Kepler and saying, Kepler had these great insights into how planets move, and then he had to spend 8 months doing these tedious calculations. And can you only imagine what Kepler might have thought of if he had been freed from that tedious labor and could have spent those 8 months kind of with shower thinking, right? So the optimist to me says, can you imagine if we put all of this grunge work down, all of this unnecessary, tedious, repetitive, not intellectual aspect of law, and let ourselves return to the stuff we learn in law school to think about, what are the policy reasons underlying this, right? Having time to go find the UChicago sociology study that shows that the actual, predictions, these things, sort of this deeper advocacy that might be possible. So that to me is the good outcome. The bad outcome is sort of this race to the bottom, McDonald'sization of the entire field where it's all just kind of cookie cuttered out. it's good enough, right? And we lose some of the sort of artistry of it. And it might sound strange to hear me talking about this as the guy from Silicon Valley who's, selling these wares. But on the contrary, I mean, I'm a lawyer. I still pay my bar dues. I think the legal profession, though much of it is unfortunately a shadow of its earlier self, still has a lot of nobility to it. And so I hope that we can use this stuff correctly to then allow us to both give more people representation and to really increase the quality of representation. That's the good outcome. The bad outcome is just, what I described.
Yeah, great point. And just to clarify, you don't sponsor Silicon Flatirons at all, and we are not, but you're one of their first to in the space. That's why we're having it. Yes, exactly.
Without a commercial.
Yes, Dan.
So just going to sort of what will be the impact on the practice of law, I do think, everyone has to make their own judgment, but I do think there's a tremendous amount of change that is going to happen in the near term. And I think that it is impossible to predict exactly how that will play out because it is a byproduct of how the technology will change, how different people will use the technology, how different companies will change the technology and build on it, and also, frankly, laws and regulations, what will be allowed, what won't be allowed. And so in my mind, the most important thing is for everyone to stay nimble, right? And to think about both individually, how do you start using this technology? Where would you use this technology? How would you use it? Becoming familiar with it. I think every lawyer, every law student should be at least starting to familiarize themselves with this. I think that there is some amount of just time in building on that. And frankly, I think organizationally, a lot of firms, a lot of schools need to be thinking about maintaining flexibility to be able to pivot. And I do think there are a lot of scenarios where maybe there are a lot of negative scenarios where maybe you need fewer attorneys. Maybe there are less hiring needs of big law, but then a lot of positive opportunities where maybe there's an opportunity to serve more people because you can more efficiently, whatever. If you can write a will in an hour instead of 10 hours, well, all of a sudden now there are a lot more people who you can actually help. And so I think that there are huge opportunities, but there's going to be huge change and disruption. And I think folks need to start grappling with that now, both individually and organizationally. And if you wait too long, that might be a mistake.
Those are some great points. And one issue that we hadn't talked about, but I think is important, is opportunities for access to justice. So Megan and I are working on a project at Stanford to help use some of these new technologies to help underserved communities who don't have access to lawyers to get help with some of their legal questions. So Dan, your question was great that your answer was great that lawyers need to get involved, and you've recently written some scholarship about this. So what can lawyers do now? How should they embrace these technologies?
Well, that allows me to plug my paper, right?
Yeah.
So thank you, Harry. So I have a few different papers looking at this, and I'm working on more. So one paper I have that is more just sort of a way of I guess, a first process for using this is called AI Tools for Lawyers, a Practical Guide. And it's on Google. But essentially, it just walks people through some of the basic things like chain of reason and logic that Harry mentioned. But then it also sort of talks through how can you, even really practical stuff, if you have a case that's too long to plug into it, how can you plug in that case into GPT so that you can actually get it to think through the entire case and analyze it? Or how can you ask it to cite the relevant provision, something I alluded to earlier? How can you get it to not only draft the contract, but then identify the ambiguities and then clarify the ambiguities? So it just walks through some basic techniques, and it's really designed as a way to get lawyers and law students to start actually familiarizing themselves with this technology. I think in a year it will probably be very outdated, right? If it's not already outdated now, which I hope not. But I think that the first thing to do is use this, frankly, spend the $20 a month to get GPT-4 because it is really different than GPT 3.5, right? So I think everyone should be sending OpenAI. They're $20 a month.
But not case text to 500 a month.
Oh yeah, right. No, add case text if you can get it. If you can get on their way past their wait.
We're also not sponsored by OpenAI.
And start using this technology because there is a craft to it. And there's also just an understanding of where it will help and where it won't help and how can you use it better. So I think developing that skill set is an important first step. And then one of the things, obviously, you know, I'm a law school professor, and actually I came to this a lot because I started working as a fellow before I became a professor, teaching legal research and writing. And so I think it's really important to start thinking about how to train our students to use this well. But I actually am of the opinion that the first thing we need to do is to teach them to do legal research and writing without this technology. I think it is one of the dangers here is over-reliance on this technology to the point where you can't understand what it's doing well and what it's not doing well. And I've heard people make this analogy, and I quite like it. We teach kids how to do addition and subtraction and multiplication before we give them access to a calculator. And I think that that is very important because there's a way in which those skills are fundamental, and it's even important that even though we can trust a calculator. Well, imagine a calculator that makes mistakes some of the time, right? And so I think right now that pedagogically, we need to be teaching students how to do core legal research and writing, how to analogize and distinguish, how to write clearly, how to synthesize rules for multiple cases and apply those rules to facts in a sort of compelling fashion and leverage policy arguments. But then once we have that foundation, then allowing them to use this technology to further refine that and make it more efficient. And so going to one study we did one study where we just looked at how ChatGPT did on law school exams, and what we found is it got about a C+. Okay, but it was able to get a C+ in a variety of different areas where we just used a single prompt. Okay, single prompt that was used for all different exams. It was the paper's called ChatGPT Goes to Law School, and it's already performing at the level of a not very good law student. Right, but still in an employee benefits class, in a constitutional law class, in a torts class. So we have a new experiment that we're working on now, where what we're going to do is use GPT-4, but we're going to use it and have students use that in concert with their own skills and see what type of difference that makes in terms of their ability to perform. And the hypothesis, we'll have to see how things play out, is that GPT-4 is going to allow law students to not only perform much better on exams, on analytical tasks, but we're also we have a separate experiment where we're doing it on sort of simple legal tasks, draft a contract, draft a memo, draft a complaint. And I think what we're going to find, again, hypothesis, we'll see, is that this technology allows them to work much more quickly if they're trained well, and to work much more efficiently. And so I think that it's a process, and we need to train law students, we need to train lawyers to use this technology well, and that will take some thought. But I think that if we're thoughtful about it, it really does represent a huge change in how lawyers are going to work.
That was a really thorough answer, and you made a bunch of great points, particularly about everyone should be at least trying out this technology and testing it, particularly GPT-4. And I will say there is a way to get a version of it for free using Bing Chat. It's not the same thing, but it kind of gives you a sense of what's going on. But don't put your private client data in there. Yes. Any other comments on that? What should lawyers be doing? I mean, Pablo.
I think like steady as she goes. I mean, a lot of the stuff you guys are learning are doctrinal. And these are century-old principles and ways of legal reasoning that, frankly, aren't really impacted by technology. And I think you need to really have those down solidly. And I would say that I would rather have a mind that had to wrestle with the blank page from scratch and clumsily futz around and strike out and then take longer, but then learn how to go from complete blank to an ordered system than somebody who thinks that they're, adding better adverbs to a draft that GPT-4 comes out. So make no mistake, you guys are not on the clock. No one's paying you per hour. Once you're practicing, there's other constraints, right? If I can do it faster, it's not about me. Your guys' number one job is to create the kind of brains and minds that can advance the profession and serve the rule of law. And my personal two-bit on this is, learning how to hey, have it make a draft and I'll edit it. You kind of know how to do that. It's just like if your friend gives you something to edit, it's, right? Suffering through that pain of that blank page, you might get around it, but ask yourself who suffers there. My 2 cents, and probably not the view of Casetext's marketing team, actually, if I asked them about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It raises a larger issue that, lawyers are not contract drafting machines or document, they're advocates and problem solvers help people through the legal system. So those skills in conjunction with the basic skills are still going to be necessary. Did you have a comment? No, okay. So we have one more question, then we're going to open up to the audience for questions. We hesitate to speculate, but we'll do it anyway. Where do you see this technology going in law or elsewhere in the next 2 to 3 years? And I'll just throw this out to the panel. And I picked 2 to 3 years because this is changing so rapidly. I don't even think 5 years from now we can do a reliable prediction, let alone 20.
Yeah, I think it's going to be much more quickly adopted than anything we've ever seen. Law is a conservative group overall, but if what I've seen over the last 7 months is any indication, they seem to be making an exception for computers that can read. And I think you'll see widespread adoption. I think that you'll start to see some fraying of the billable hour structure. Some form of the business will change, and that probably will impact how many people are getting hiring and for what. You might literally start to see that move pretty quickly. And I don't mean that in a doomsday way. I think it'll be maybe different distributions of associates doing different things. And I think we'll all be using, it'll be in our phones. It'll be just second nature for us to be using these LLMs to do the vast majority of things we're going to do. And I think we'll find it quite joyful. I think it's going to be a very wonderful feeling to have an AI that can schedule a damn calendar event and then, adjust for the Eastern time versus Pacific time and, do all of these things that if you actually added up, in our life we're dealing with.
Great. Dan.
So I remember when I was a young associate in, I guess it was 2004, doing discovery, and we didn't even have e-discovery then. And I remember sitting on my computer and literally just doing looking for keywords for hours on end, and then billing clients, thousands of dollars from me. How did I go to law school and do a clerkship to become a trained monkey, right? And I think that there's still a lot of that in the practice of law for young associates. Let's be real. And I do think there's the real potential for this technology to allow lawyers and law students to have more fun in doing their job and also to have more work-life balance. I don't think that this technology is going to put lawyers out of work. I just don't. Do I think it will change demand? Do I think that there may be some reduced hiring needs at some places? I do. But I think that there's actually a lot of ways in which things like soft skills are going to become more important, right? Can you communicate with people? Can you translate what's on the page to explanation? Can you develop relationships? Can you be an advocate? Can you be a strategic thinker? I think those are actually going to be the more prized skills that lawyers are going to need to have and law students are going to need to cultivate even in the next 2 or 3 years. And I do think the practice of law for many will get more fun because we can automate what is still a pretty grueling process in some element, like the discovery or the, produce a complaint that, of the type that you've, if you're just an auto accident lawyer, right? It's the same complaint. You're just copying and pasting, putting things you can do that now without having to spend an hour copying and pasting. Or if you're writing something and, it's the summary judgment standard, you've written it 8,000 times, right? You can just tell GPT, okay, do that for me. So I think that there is a lot of hope, but also a lot of risk, even just the next few years.
So lawyers having 20-hour work weeks. We'll see if that happens. But no, those are some great comments. Jason.
Yeah, so I mean, I think echo the statements of the other speakers in terms of what the future is going to look like. I think it's definitely going to be everywhere, right? I mean, right now, we see it in a couple of tools. I think it's going to, in terms of technology for law, it's just literally going to be everywhere, either on the surface or sort of underlying it. In terms of kind of impact, I would expect that the transactional practices, especially those that kind of have fixed fee models, are going to be most incentivized to figure out how to take advantage of that. So I think that's probably where there'll be kind of initial adoption. And one of the things that I think maybe seems strange to consider right now, right? I mean, GPT-4 came out in March. We all kind of have a little sense of vertigo, right? Of how quickly this has changed. I think we're going to adapt and almost be bored of this even by the fall, right? We're currently amazed by its ability to be able to draft summary judgment or draft a patent or do analysis. I think people are very quickly going to mentally adapt to, okay, here's a set of tasks before that I had to grind through. Why am I doing that, right? I should be using some tools to either, help me do quick summaries of things, to do outlines, to draft small pieces. And I think it's going to quickly find its way into just, things that people take for granted.
Megan?
I think, well, not only do I agree with sort of the other panelists in terms of their speculation for the future, I think another interesting area of what large language models could do is its ability, and Jason sort of teased this, is its ability to tease out our implicit behaviors. I think a lot of our existing legal work is actually, we think about some of the best clauses that we've ever written. We tend to like to keep those to ourselves at times. And I think that if these models are kind of integrated into our workspaces, such as our Google workspace or our Office, we might start to see kind of the habits in which we've taken over time and how we draft. And I think that that's going to be really interesting in terms of kind of the future of being able to almost adapt and change the way that we act or behave as lawyers. And so I think that is going to be an area that is particularly interesting.
Great. Well, those are all great comments on our speculation. So let me open it up to the audience for questions. We have a tradition here at Silicon Flatirons that our first question goes to a student. So, we've got a student very eagerly volunteering. Terrific. And we encourage more student questions as well.
Hi, my name's Christine. I'm a PhD student in computer science here at CU. I am wondering what you think some of the practical solutions might be to the current disparity in access to this technology, either directly or as a third party, fourth party beneficiary.
We need more chips. We need better GPUs and more of them as fast as possible, right? I mean, I think that's, to my mind, one of the things that's making it very expensive. Just literally running it. I wasn't sure. Are you looking for like a technical or a societal answer? Both.
Either, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I have a thought, which is the government does need to get involved. This is a big enough technology like the internet. And I think somebody said there's been ideas about having an Apollo program, and not just around the technology, around ethics and governance, I think there should be a public free option. This is an important enough technology down the road, electricity or running water, not immediately, but I think the government needs to get involved. Yeah.
I think also as well, there's an important question around open source and licensing of certain underlying models. We've seen most recently DALL-E came out, which is an entirely open source model. I think there needs to be more of that. And a lot of these models are built on Llama, which is a model that Meta put out there. But the licensing issues around that are not well defined. And I think until we resolve those questions, then we can have definitely sort of more space for free access to these models.
So I'll just say, I'm less convinced that it's imperative that everyone get their hands on these models and use them, because I think that the value of these models really depends, and the use really depends on context, right? And I think that one of the great things about these for lawyers is how much more efficient it can make law. And that then can actually have huge distributional consequences, right? So, I mean, there's this well-known fact in the law that, like, we have too many lawyers on the one hand, but we have hugely not enough on the other, because there's so many people who don't actually have access to legal services who need them, for wills, for divorces, for custody matters. And I think that, I'm not sure that we're ever going to get to a point where people are going to be able to, or at least in the next 2 or 3 years, let me put it that way, where you don't even need to hire a lawyer. It's just, oh, I have a will and I need this, and boom. There's some tools that purport to do that. But where I do think this can be transformative from a distributional perspective is maybe I only need to pay a lawyer, $100 to produce a will, because for them, it's literally just a matter of, getting a few data points, plugging in, and then just checking. Okay, and making sure that it's doing what you want. I do think we need the human in the loop there who has some expertise, but that expertise can just be a matter of, let me spend 15 minutes reviewing the output and fine tuning it, right? Saying, oh, expand this or add this, whatever else. So I think that distributional concerns may actually not lead to the sort of, we need to give everyone access to this all at once. As opposed to, we need to make sure that folks are using these tools in a way that allows them to achieve efficiencies that can serve a wide subset of the population.
Yeah, so I'll just add, it's clear that this technology kind of is a democratizing force for lots of, specific information that previously people would have had a hard time getting to. The risk, right, is hallucinations and whatnot, is people may not be able to trust all the information that's coming from it. So I think the bottleneck right now, anybody can go to Bing and you can talk to it. You may or may not get what you want out of it. I think figuring out how to get the correctly curated versions of this out to the right people is honestly an open question. I think it's going to require the right experts and the right sort of regulations in place to be able to get a vetted version of this for the different domains where it might be applicable.
Another question from the audience over here.
Am I supposed to introduce myself? I'm not going to do that. So you've talked about the of how this is going to impact the practice of law, like from the, say like internal perspective. And I know this is like a whole nother panel, so I'll try to like ask the question, then give like a more specific example. But do you have any thoughts on the current impact it's having, if I can speak for myself personally, of advising your clients, especially if you're in the technology sector or work in-house, on the using of these tools? Or is your company developing a product that uses them, which they probably are, by the way. And I think the context I'll give you just to narrow that question a little bit is software, right? You mentioned code generation tools, of which, of course, there's Copilot, everyone's heard of, but there's many, and models around that. I think that's most relevant to this audience, both from the legal and the technology sector, on just, that's part of the practice of law, right? Is not just how we might use them internally, but how are we dealing with advising on both sides of that coin. So I just wonder if you guys had thoughts on that.
I think the most obvious thing is you need to have a policy. You need to have a policy. So there's so many employers out there that I think don't even have a policy for this for their employees, for instance, or that just ban it. And I think actually in the very short term, banning its use may not be a bad idea in certain contexts, right? It's not clear to me that, given there's so much uncertainty, it's not clear to me that we want, certain employees to be using it to do their job right now, because we don't know exactly how to vet it. But I think that at the very least you need to address it. And I think that there are a lot of, you need to do it quickly. But a lot of times systems, over time have developed to produce, internal policies or and they take time. And I think we don't have that time right now. You need to have at least a basic policy in place. And like for universities, like, or even for my students, right? Like for right now, I'm going to ban them using GPT on their exams, right? Like for now. And then maybe we'll have a class where we teach them how to use it and we're using it. But I think just addressing it is the first step.
And I would just say educating yourself about, again, if all you saw was people doing donuts on the lawn and going 90 on the freeway and backwards, you'd say no cars. How about that? That seems like a very good idea in that world, right? And I think really going and understanding how these things can be used responsibly, which means secure servers where the data is not retained, where you're not feeding into the model, where you're using, you're coupling it to a search engine to go over hallucinations, where there's guardrails to check quotes, all of these different things. I just think you need to learn about them because it's a very different world when you're using them correctly.
Great. Another question from the audience.
Thanks. My application is healthcare. I'm thinking about the very direct utility of your lessons to a physician trying to do the same kind of stuff with the same kind of problems. Well, one of the threats that we deal with in medicine, though, is a direct-to-consumer application where they're bypassing the provider entirely and they got access to these amazing tools. 100 years ago, we would say it's illegal for a consumer to have a stethoscope. That's ridiculous. Now you can get an ultrasound. You do your own. So it's not just democratization, but there's going to have to be some thought about do we have a way of making these apps safe for consumer direct use, where the practitioner only learns about them later. You come into the ER, your appendectomy is halfway done, and we need to figure out like where did chat leave off, So then I would throw this back at you, because I don't know if you can answer that for medicine. Good luck to try, but in law you got this pro se thing, and what happens when a murderer shows up in court and says, I've got my defense all prepared. Don't worry, judge. Here, I got it all here. I'll hand it to you. Ready? I'm innocent. So in any profession, you'd like to engineering, aerospace, corrections, pick the fun ones. What happens, though? We can't control this entirely as professionals, right? It's already long out of the.
Yeah. We don't let pro se people use our service. You have to be an attorney because of that. But also ask yourself. You can get pretty informed by a search result on Google and think you're ready to go into your search. You know what I mean? So ask yourself how much of this is just consumers having access to information that they could then foolishly think suffices to make an informed professional decision, and how much of it is actually about AI, right? I think maybe it's a matter of degree, but we don't want people using it unless they're attorneys, because I think it does give the illusion of maybe being more concrete legal advice than it actually is. It needs attorney oversight.
So you're going to make it illegal for
Well,
you have to have show your license in order to
maybe
turn
if we get our revenue up, we'll finally be able to help make law.
Anyone else on the panel want to comment on that?
I think licensure issues are really tricky. I tend to think that they've been abused in many settings to actually protect incumbents, but at the same time, I think that they're necessary in a variety of settings as well. And so I think that we will continue to rely on licensure to ensure that pro se is tough, but to ensure that you can't just hire your friend to represent you, and that you have to, if you're going to get medical treatment, you have someone who's licensed and knows what they're doing. But as I said, I think it's tough. I think that we'll also see the abuse of licensure rules to protect industries that maybe should be shrinking. And whether that's law or not, I guess I'm not sure. But I do think that that's a possibility. And so they're just tricky issues there. I don't know. I really don't know what the right answer is. I think it's going to be very context dependent. But I think licensure is the biggest answer we can provide, as well as warnings, right? And we have the warnings there, right, already. Some of them are, Google's more aggressive in its warning about what Bard will do, saying, look, don't trust this at all. This is completely, we don't have that for ChatGPT or GPT-4. Like, there are actually fewer warnings. So I don't know. I don't honestly also know how effective those warnings are. It tends to be most warnings are not that effective. So
I just want to.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to go back to kind of your question on medicine. So a while back, there was a tool called Babylon Health, which was trying to triage and diagnose these medical symptoms. And they, purport to say we have 92% accuracy. The average experienced medical professional of 30 years is 85%. But what we really get from this information is, what do we really want from our professionals? Is it that when you receive this information, is it accuracy the only thing that we're weighing? Doctors, we want that empathetic angle. What if you receive bad medical news? This machine is not going to give you that same empathy. And so I think when it comes to making that analogy with lawyers and whatnot, we need to really be rethinking kind of what our role is as a lawyer that extends beyond the information that we are communicating.
That's a great point. And one additional point I'll layer on top of that is we always want to weigh the benefits and the harms. So those are some real harms, but also today people are being harmed by not getting medical or legal advice that they can maybe get in this new world. Well, we are out of time, so please join me in thanking this terrific panel.